The great hall of River Run was cold despite the roaring hearth. The flickering torchlight illuminated the battered figure of Lord Karstark, his gray beard stained with blood and his hands bound before him. He knelt at the foot of the dais, his eyes burning with fury, waiting for the young wolf's verdict. "My lord father would not have suffered a traitor to live," Robb Stark said, gripping the pommel of his sword, ice. His voice was hard, but uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Lord Karstark spat on the floor. "Your father is dead, and you lost the war the moment you put a crown on your head, boy." Catelyn Stark watched from the side, her hands clasped tightly. She knew Robb was torn between duty and the need for every sword. She had made one desperate plea earlier. "If you kill him, you may lose half your army." Edmure Tully cleared his throat. "Robb, this man murdered 2 boys under your protection. That cannot go unanswered." Silence fell over the hall. The Karstark men stood at the edges, watching, waiting. If their lord died, so too did their loyalty. Robb exhaled sharply and stepped forward. "Lord Rickard, I will not execute you." Murmurs rippled through the hall, some in relief, others in disbelief. Lord Karstark's eyes narrowed. "You grow soft, boy." "No," Robb said firmly, "but I will not behead my own men when I need every sword. You will remain my prisoner until this war is won." The tension in the hall shifted. Some Karstark men straightened, eyes wary but no longer hostile. The immediate bloodshed was averted, but the war was far from over. Robb Stark's decision spread through the camp like wildfire. Some whispered that he had grown weak, that he had failed to uphold the stark justice his father once wielded. But among the Karstark men, there was a different kind of talk, a murmur of loyalty renewed. Their lord was still alive. Their swords still had a cause. That night, Robb sat in his tent, staring at the maps before him. The Riverlands were a battlefield, and the Lannisters still held Harrenhal. The Freys were bitter over his broken oath, and his uncle Edmure was sulking over being ordered to hold River Run instead of leading the charge. The war teetered on the edge of disaster, but for the first time in weeks, he had not lost more men to desertion. Roose Bolton entered without announcement, his cold blue eyes unreadable. "My king," Bolton said, his tone neutral, "you've made a practical choice." Robb knew Bolton too well to trust him. He had little love for the Karstarks, but he valued strategy. "I need men," Robb said, "not more graves." Bolton tilted his head. "A pity. The Karstark men would have stayed even if you had lopped off their lord's head. They need a king more than a father." Robb clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had no illusions about Bolton's loyalty. The Dreadfort Lord followed strength, not honor. The conversation was interrupted when Catelyn Stark entered, her expression guarded. She had been silent after the trial, watching her son with wary approval. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Robb sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I hope so. I can't afford another mistake." Catelyn hesitated before stepping closer. "There's something else. Lord Karstark has a request." Robb looked up sharply. "A request? He's my prisoner. He wishes to speak with you, alone." Inside his cell, Lord Rickard Karstark sat on a wooden bench, his wrists unchained but his body weighed down with exhaustion. He looked up as Robb entered. "I thought you'd come sooner," the old lord said. Robb crossed his arms. "Speak." Karstark smirked. "I called you a boy. That was wrong. You're a king, and you've proven it." Robb remained silent, wary of the change in tone. Karstark leaned forward. You spared my life, and now you have my loyalty. Not half-hearted or reluctant, but full. I will fight for you, truly. My men will follow me, and I will follow you. But if you want to win this war, you need more than just loyalty. You need vengeance. Robb frowned. Vengeance against the Lannisters? No, Karstark said, his voice lowering. Vengeance against those who would betray you. The Freys will not forget your insult, and Rose Bolton is a snake in your camp. Robb stiffened. You speak treason. I speak truth, Karstark said, voice harsh. You think Rose Bolton's loyalty is secure? Watch him. And as for the Freys, you'll need to deal with them before they deal with you. Robb stared at the old lord, his mind racing. Sparing Karstark had kept his army intact, but had it also given him a warning that could change everything? The war was not lost. It had just begun. Robb Stark left Lord Karstark's cell with a heavy mind. The old lord's words lingered, whispering like ghosts in the corridors of his thoughts. Rose Bolton, the Freys. His mother had warned him to be careful with his allies, but he had been too consumed by battle, by honor, by the weight of a crown he never sought. Now he had a chance to do things differently. The following morning he gathered his war council. Edmure Tully, Rose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, Gretchen Umber, and the Blackfish stood before him, awaiting orders. We march south, Robb announced. Edmure frowned. To Harrenhal? No, Robb said. We march to the Twins. The air in the tent tightened. Rose Bolton's expression remained unreadable, but Robb saw something flicker in his pale eyes. Calculation. You seek to make peace with Lord Walder? Bolton asked smoothly. Robb met his gaze. I seek to remind him that breaking a pact with a Stark is not without consequences. Gretchen Umber grinned. Aye, that old weasel needs to learn his place. Edmure paled. Robb, you can't be serious. If we attack the Freys, they will betray us the moment we turn our backs, Robb cut in. Lord Karstark has confirmed what we already suspect. Walder Frey is stalling. He plays both sides, waiting for an opportunity to shift his loyalties. He turned his gaze to Rose Bolton. If I am wrong, then our presence at the Twins will be a show of strength. But if I am right, then we will not allow Walder Frey to orchestrate our downfall. Bolton smiled thinly. A bold move, Your Grace. Robb nodded. Boldness is all we have left. Robb's army moved swiftly, their banners rippling in the cold autumn wind. The Karstark men, once hesitant, rode with renewed purpose. Lord Rickard had not been given back his command, but his presence at Robb's side made it clear. He was trusted. As they neared the Twins, Catelyn Stark rode beside her son, her face lined with worry. You mean to attack them, she said. It wasn't a question. Robb didn't answer immediately. He stared at the distant towers of the Twins, the river shining beneath them. If we find proof of treachery, I will not hesitate. And if there is none, Robb sighed, then we will ensure that Walder Frey remembers that his future depends on our victory. Catelyn hesitated. Your father would have sought peace. My father is dead, Robb said quietly, and I will not let his son die the same way. When Robb's army arrived at the Twins, the Freys were unprepared. Walder Frey, aged and scowling, received them with a forced smile. My king in the north, he said mockingly, I must say, I did not expect you. Robb did not bow. He stepped forward, his voice steady. We have unfinished business, Lord Frey. Frey's eyes darted toward Rose Bolton, as if seeking reassurance. Robb caught the glance. A silent message passed between them. Something was wrong. Robb smiled coldly. I think it's time we talk about loyalty. Walder Frey's great hall was as miserable as the man himself, cold, damp, and reeking of stale meat. The gathered Freys watched Robb's men with uneasy glances, their hands never far from their swords. Robb sat at the high table across from the Lord of the Crossing, his expression unreadable. Beside him, his mother Catelyn kept her composure, though he could feel the tension in her hands as they rested on the table. Great Umber stood behind Robb, arms crossed, while Rose Bolton lounged in his seat, silent and watchful. You arrive at my gates unannounced, boy, Walder Frey rasped, his wrinkled lips curling into a mockery of a smile. That's not how guests behave. I didn't come as a guest, Robb replied coolly. I came as a king. Walder snorted. A king, eh? And what does the king in the north want with poor old Walder? Robb leaned forward. I want to know where your loyalty lies. The hall went deathly silent. Several Frey sons stiffened in their seats. The tension was a noose, tightening with each passing second. Walder Frey's milky eyes gleamed with amusement. Where it always has, boy, with whoever keeps me safe. It was the answer Robb expected, but it was not the one he needed. I hear you've been in communication with Tywin Lannister, Robb continued, his voice calm, deliberate. I hear you've been stalling, waiting to see if I lose. Walder's expression didn't change, but the flicker in his eyes was enough. Robb had struck a nerve. You hear too much, Stark. I hear enough. Robb's fingers drummed the table. So tell me, Lord Frey, what did Tywin promise you? Walder Frey hesitated, but before he could answer, the doors to the hall burst open. A Karstark scout, covered in dust and sweat, rushed forward and knelt. My king, he gasped. We caught 2 Lannister riders trying to leave the castle. The hall erupted into whispers. Robb slowly turned back to Walder Frey. The old man's lips trembled for a fraction of a second before he schooled his features. But Robb had seen it. He had seen the fear. The trap had been set, but it had not sprung, because Robb had arrived first. Steel rang against steel as the battle for the twins began. The northern banners flew high as Robb's army stormed the castle. Karstark men led the charge, their fury unleashed upon the Freys who had planned their betrayal. The Greyjoy roared like a beast, cutting down Frey soldiers left and right, while the Blackfish commanded the river assault. Walder Frey had underestimated the young wolf. He had expected a broken king, a desperate one willing to beg for forgiveness. Instead, he found a wolf that had learned to hunt. Robb moved through the chaos, sword in hand. His men had orders. Kill every Frey who resisted, capture the rest. The Lannister riders had already confessed before they died. Tywin had promised Walder Frey dominion over the Riverlands if he betrayed Robb at the wedding. There would be no wedding. There would be no red wedding. There would only be justice. By the time the sun set, the twins belonged to the north. Walder Frey was dragged before Robb, his once smug face twisted in rage and fear. You dare, the old man spat. You betrayed your king, Robb said coldly, and for that you die. He did not make the mistake of his father. He did not give Walder Frey a cell or a trial or time to make more schemes. He took his sword and drove it through the old man's chest himself. The North had won a great victory, but the war was far from over. Tywin Lannister would not let this stand, and Rose Bolton was still watching, still waiting. The twins were painted in blood. Bodies of Frey soldiers and bannermen lay strewn across the muddy courtyards and the cold river banks. The banners of House Stark, House Karstark, and House Umber flew high over the twin castles, a declaration that Walder Frey's treachery had been crushed before it could be carried out. Robb Stark stood in the great hall, his hands still stained with Walder Frey's blood. The body of the old man had been dragged away, left for the crows that would feast on the remains of his shattered house. His war council gathered before him, Great Jon Umber, Lord Karstark, the Blackfish, Edmure Tully, and Rose Bolton. Catelyn Stark stood behind them, silent, her face unreadable. "The Freys are finished," Robb said. "Their men are either dead or kneeling." Great Jon grinned. "Aye, and about time. That old snake had it coming." Lord Karstark, standing with his arms crossed, nodded approvingly. "Justice has been done, Your Grace." But Edmure Tully looked pale, unsettled. "Robb, you realize what you've done, don't you?" His voice was tight with worry. "You've slaughtered one of the great houses of the Riverlands. Their bannermen will have to make a choice," Robb cut in. "They either swear loyalty to me, or they share the fate of their lord." A silence stretched between them. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. But there was still one man Robb did not trust. Rose Bolton had yet to speak. The pale-eyed lord sat at the far end of the table, watching, listening, studying. Robb turned to him. "You have been quiet, Lord Bolton." Bolton tilted his head. "There is little to say, Your Grace. You have done what needed to be done." Robb studied him carefully. Bolton had supported the Red Wedding in the original timeline. But now he had no Freys to conspire with. The betrayal had been stopped before it could ever begin. But that did not make him any less dangerous. 3 days later, Robb sent ravens across Westeros. To the lords of the Riverlands, the North, and beyond, the message was clear. The Freys were traitors. They paid the price. The North remembers. But he also sent another message, one meant for Tywin Lannister. A dozen captured Freys were sent south in chains, escorted by Karstark riders. Along with them, Robb sent the severed hand of the Lannister spies caught within the twins. A warning, a declaration of war. Tywin Lannister was many things, but he was no fool. He had counted on the Freys to remove the northern threat in one swift stroke. Now that plan was ash, and worse, Robb's army had only grown stronger. The Karstarks were fully loyal. The River Lords, once wavering, now rallied behind their young wolf, knowing that he had avenged the insult to his house. For the first time since the war began, Robb was not just fighting to survive. He was fighting to win. Robb knew he could not sit idle. The Lannisters would recover, and soon they would strike back. The best way to stop them? Strike first. Harrenhal was the key. It was the gateway to the Riverlands and the most important stronghold between the North and the Crown Lands. And at this moment, it was still held by the remnants of Tywin's forces under Gregor Clegane. The mountain. It was time to take it. Robb led his army south. The Karstarks rode in force, their loyalty no longer in doubt. The Great Jon and his berserkers marched alongside them, and Rose Bolton, ever the strategist, remained close. His own plans hidden beneath a mask of obedience. The siege of Harrenhal was brutal. Gregor Clegane did not surrender easily, but Robb was smarter, faster. He used his cavalry to lure the mountain's men into the open fields, where the northern archers cut them down. By the time the walls of Harrenhal were breached, The mountain had fled, leaving the castle abandoned. Harrenhal belonged to Robb Stark, but inside they found something far more valuable than a castle. Inside a darkened cell, chained and near death, was Arya Stark. Arya Stark was barely more than a shadow when they found her. The cold stone walls of Harrenhal had swallowed her whole, turning the once feisty girl into something smaller, something hardened. She flinched when the torches flared in her cell, her hands curling into fists. Then she saw him. Robb Stark stood in the doorway, his sword at his hip, his cloak stained with the blood of his enemies. For a moment neither of them spoke. "Arya?" His voice was rough, uncertain. She hesitated. Her brother stood before her, but she had learned not to trust hope. Hope had led her to think her father would live. Hope had led her to believe that her mother and Robb were safe. Hope had almost gotten her killed too many times. Then Grey Wind stepped forward, the massive dire wolf sniffing at her, his yellow eyes bright with recognition. Her fingers clenched, then released. "Robb?" she whispered. In 2 strides he had crossed the cell and pulled her into his arms. She was thin, too thin, but she was alive. His little sister was alive. The war had taken so much from him, his father, his home, his peace. But for the first time, it had given him something back. The wolves were not finished yet. When news of the fall of Harrenhal reached King's Landing, Tywin Lannister was silent. He listened as his council whispered of the disaster, of the Frey's annihilation, of Robb Stark's brutal vengeance, of the North's sudden resurgence. But what made the old lion pause was the mention of Arya Stark. "The boy has his sister," Pycelle wheezed. "That will only strengthen his resolve." Tywin steepled his fingers. "Yes, it will." Robb Stark was no longer a cornered wolf. He was a predator on the hunt. For the first time, Tywin was beginning to consider something unthinkable. The war might not be winnable, unless drastic action was taken. And that was when Roose Bolton made his move. Harrenhal was not a safe place. Robb knew this. They were still deep in enemy territory, surrounded by lands that could turn against them at any moment. But the fortress was valuable, and they needed a moment to regroup. That night, as the fires burned low, Roose Bolton acted. A blade in the dark, a whisper of treason. But it was not Robb Stark's throat that the knife found. It was Bolton's own. Lord Karstark had been watching him. Ever since Robb had spared his life, he had turned his hatred elsewhere. And now, as Bolton made one move, Karstark's men were already waiting. They cut him down before he could even reach the king's tent. By the time dawn broke, Roose Bolton's body was hanging from the walls of Harrenhal, a dire wolf banner draped over it. The traitors were dead. The wolves had learned their lessons. And the war was now fully Robb Stark's to win. The news of Roose Bolton's execution sent ripples across Westeros. For years he had been known as a man of patience, a schemer in the shadows. Yet when he made his move, it was he who fell. Robb Stark was proving to be a different kind of king, a Stark who did not fall into the same traps that had doomed his ancestors. He had spared Lord Karstark and gained unwavering loyalty. He had marched on the twins before treachery could unfold. He had taken Harrenhal and saved Arya. And now Roose Bolton, the hidden dagger of the South, was dead before he could twist the knife. The war had changed. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister sat in his chambers, staring at the reports before him. His fingers tapped against the polished wood of his desk. "The boy is learning," he murmured. Kevan Lannister, standing beside him, looked uneasy. We underestimated him. Tywin exhaled sharply. Yes. Silence stretched between them. Kevin finally spoke. Then what do we do? Tywin leaned back in his chair. We bleed him. If Robb Stark would not be tricked into slaughter, then he would be forced into a war of attrition. The North was strong, but its armies were far from home. The longer the war lasted, the harder it would be for the boy king to maintain control. We send word to the Reach, Tywin ordered. Mace Tyrell will march his armies north. The Freys may be gone, but the Riverlands will still burn. And what of the North? Kevin asked. Tywin's lips curled slightly. The Greyjoys. As Robb Stark prepared for his next move, a raven arrived from the north. The Ironborn had struck. Winterfell was under siege, its gates broken by Balon Greyjoy's forces. The Dreadfort had fallen in the chaos, its hold weakened after Bolton's death. Deepwood Motte burned, and Moat Cailin was now held by the Krakens. For the first time in months, Robb hesitated. His war was in the south, but his home was bleeding. What do we do? Arya asked. She stood beside him now, no longer the frightened girl in a Harrenhal cell. She was still young, but she had seen enough of the world to know the truth. Robb looked at the map, his fingers trailing over the north. They want to draw us back, he said. They want me to divide my forces. Edmure Tully spoke up. Then don't. Stay in the south. Press the advantage. Lord Karstark shook his head. Number the north is our strength. If we lose it, we lose everything. Robb turned to the Blackfish. If we march back, we lose momentum. If we stay, the north may be lost. The Blackfish was silent for a moment, then spoke. Then we do what wolves do best. Robb frowned. Which is? We hunt. Instead of retreating north, Robb did the unthinkable. He marched west. With the Freys gone and the River Lords fully under his command, the young wolf unleashed his armies upon Lannister lands. The castles of the Westerlands, long untouched by war, suddenly found themselves under siege. Lannisport burned. The gold mines of Castamere were sealed and flooded once more. The banners of House Stark and House Tully flew over the wreckage of the Lion's Wealth. Tywin Lannister had thought he could bleed the boy king. Instead, Robb Stark was bleeding him. And far to the north, an unexpected force moved to reclaim Winterfell, a force led by Jon Snow. The banners of the direwolf flew high over Lannisport as the northern army moved like a storm through the Westerlands. The land of gold, once untouched by war, now lay in ruin. Robb Stark had learned well. Where Tywin Lannister had burned the Riverlands, Robb burned the West. Every gold mine was sealed, every village left in ruin. The wealth of House Lannister was turning to dust. And far to the north, Winterfell was about to rise again. Jon Snow had not expected to lead an army. He was a man of the Night's Watch, sworn to defend the Wall. But when word reached him that Winterfell had fallen to the Ironborn, he had made his choice. With the wildlings who had sworn loyalty to him, the remnants of House Manderly, and the scattered forces of the north, he marched. The Ironborn never expected a fight from within the north. They had believed the wolves were too busy in the south. They were wrong. The battle for Winterfell was bloody. The Ironborn, outnumbered and unprepared for a true northern counterattack, were slaughtered. The gates were retaken, the castle restored. When Jon Snow entered the great hall of Winterfell, he did not sit on the Lord's chair. He knelt. A raven flew that night to the Westerlands. Winterfell is yours again, your grace. Robb Stark read the letter in silence. His brother had given him back his home, And now it was time to end the war. King's Landing was in chaos. The Westerlands were burning. The North had risen again. Tywin Lannister had played his last hand and lost. But the old lion did not bow. Instead, he prepared his final defense. Every soldier, every gold-cloaked guard, every knight loyal to the throne was summoned to King's Landing. The capital would be his final stronghold. Robb Stark did not hesitate. With his army at full strength, with the river lords, the north, and even the freed bannermen of the Westerlands behind him, he marched on King's Landing. Tywin Lannister stood on the battlements, watching as the direwolf banners closed in. He had won so many wars, outplayed so many men, but he had never faced a Stark who learned from his mistakes. The gates of King's Landing broke, the North remembered, and the war was over. Robb Stark stood in the throne room of the Red Keep. The Iron Throne loomed before him, cold and sharp, but he did not sit on it. Instead, he turned to his men. The war had been won, but the North had never been meant to rule the South. He would not make the same mistake as Aegon. Instead, he placed his hand on his sword. "The North will never kneel again," he declared, and with that, he turned away from the Iron Throne. The North had won its freedom, and Robb Stark had won the war. Loyal, the Freys were destroyed. The Boltons fell before they could betray him. The North was saved, and Tywin Lannister lost everything. What do you think?